Hello everyone, welcome back to NonCompete. I'm American Johnson, and I just finished editing the hour-long video that stands before you. I just want to make a little note here. It is a little bit dry. I talk about some pretty heavy theory kind of stuff, and it's not the most fun-packed non-compete video we've ever done, but I think it's important stuff, and I think that hopefully, I learned a lot making the video, and I hope that you'll learn a lot as well if you'll stick with it. But yeah, I just wanted to warn you, it's a long one. There's a lot of theory in it, but I think you'll hopefully enjoy it and get something out of it if you have an hour to spare, or maybe you can watch it in chunks. That might be a better way to do it with this one. I don't know, but I think it's a cool topic. Intersectionalism, dialectical materialism, and take it away, American Johnson, with the long-ass video that no one's going to watch. W.E.B. Du Bois was an early pioneer in analyzing Marxist philosophy through the lens of race. While teaching a class on Marx's capitalism, Du Bois poignantly highlighted the ways in which class struggle intersects with race struggle. Du Bois described the emancipation of black slaves in the United States of America as one of the most extraordinary experiments of Marxism that the world before the Russian Revolution had seen. Black labor, Du Bois wrote, became the foundation not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. Without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. It is the colonies which have created world trade, and world trade is the necessary condition for large-scale machine industry. Now, all of these observations sprung directly from analysis of Marxist theories of class struggle. Du Bois couched black slaves as the core of the proletariat during the time of slavery, and he described resistance to slavery during the American Civil War as a general strike. As a black man, Du Bois was able to see important parallels between American chattel slavery and Marxist class struggle where orthodox white Marxists could not, and his contributions to Marxist theory have led to a century of analysis of the ways in which race, gender, ableism, and other forms of discrimination and oppression fit into the material dialectic of Marxist philosophy. Now, what the hell is dialectical materialism? We'll get to that. But first, let's fast forward about a century to Kimberle Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality in a paper in 1989 to help explain the ways in which black women are oppressed in modern American society. Crenshaw realized that white women and women of color experience gender oppression differently. As she put it, the location of women of color at the intersection of race and gender makes our actual experience of domestic violence, rape, and remedial reform qualitatively different from that of white women. Crenshaw's writing launched a new era of analysis of how people are oppressed in modern capitalist societies. So what I'd like to dissect today is the class reductionist perspective on intersectionalism, and I'd like to give my case for intersectionalism as an essential part of the leftist movement. After talking to several class reductionists and reading a lot of literature, I think I've found some places where communication between class reductionists and intersectionalist leftists have broken down, and some gross misunderstandings of leftist intersectionalism. This video will hopefully serve two purposes. I'm going to try to provide a basic explanation of dialectical material analysis in plain English so that any viewer will hopefully be able to walk away understanding what the hell I'm talking about. And I'll also be using dialectical material analysis as we go along to explain and justify the role of intersectionalism within our leftist movement. So first, let's break down that scary word dialectical materialism and try to make some sense of it. Dialectics is simply a method of finding truth through argument. Socrates wrote Dialectics, in which two characters would argue with each other until they arrived at some truth which they both kind of agreed on. The classical format of a dialectical analysis looks like this. A thesis is presented, which is a guess about what might be correct. An antithesis is returned, which is an argument against the thesis, antithesis. And then hopefully a synthesis is worked out, which allows the thesis and antithesis to be reconciled into one deeper truth. So here's a simple example. Thesis: bananas are fruits. Antithesis: well, that can't be true because apples are fruits. Synthesis: both bananas and apples are fruits. Now, this triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is a grossly simplified version of dialectics, at least compared to the way that Marx and Engels and other more modern leftists have used them. Materialist dialectics recognize that these processes are constantly progressing through a series called negation. As objects and ideas advance through time, they are negated. What they are, in essence, changes through a constant process of advancement and development. So take, for example, a seed. Plant the seed and water it, and it will become a seedling. It is no longer a seed. The seed has been negated. It has not been destroyed. It has not been obliterated, but the seed itself no longer exists. A seedling now exists. It has been negated. The seed has negated into a seedling. Those seedlings will be negated into plants, and those plants will then negate into new seeds. And over time, the seeds will develop in various ways, generation after generation. And this development can be manipulated by humans. We can make them bigger, more delicious, more nutritious. We can make them suit our needs however we want to through manipulating the negation process. And slowly but surely over time, through the process of negation, these plants will develop. And this process never really ends. Theses and antitheses and syntheses do not end. A dialectical argument may not arrive at a synthesis of conclusion, but it may give us deeper understanding of both sides of an argument. It may bring us further along towards a deeper truth, and hopefully we'll understand both sides of that argument through the process of dialectical material analysis. And through the process of dialectical negation, objects and ideas and societies advance and develop, and this is a fundamental truth of our reality. So what about materialism? Materialism is very simply the idea that the real physical world exists. There is one physical world in which we all exist, and that this is the most important component of reality, and that human thoughts and ideas are reflections of the real world. Marx believed that human consciousness was defined by material conditions, and that dialectics should be rooted in physical reality. So dialectical materialism is a dialectical method of finding truth which is rooted in a material reality. It is a form of analysis which Marx and Engels used to scientifically explain the human condition and to find solutions to human problems. Now, dialectical materialism stands in contrast to what you might call traditional formal logic. Logic is kind of a way of analyzing static systems where things never change. So like, for instance, mathematics, 2 is always 2, 4 is always 4. Dialectics has been described as the logic of change. It is a form of logic that allows us to examine things as they are changing and the nature of that change and what prompts those changes and how those changes are directed in the material world. So the first principle we must examine is the principle of qualities and quantities. Quantity and quality have very specific meaning in dialectical material analysis. Quantities are the individual little pieces that together make a quality. So if a football team is a quality, then each individual player on the team is a quantity. Quantities require a certain critical mass before they can assume a quality. So if you have 2 football players together, like riding a bus or whatever, they're not a football team. And if you have 2 grains of sand sitting next to each other, they do not have the quality of a pile of sand. Certain conditions must be met. A sort of a critical mass must be achieved before the quantities achieve the status of a given quality. And the quantities and qualities can relate with each other in various and complex ways. So Engels, Marx's old writing buddy, was a bit of an armchair general, and he often used military metaphors to discuss the relationships between quality and quantity. So for example, say there are 2 armies and the soldiers in each army have different strengths and weaknesses. The soldiers of the first army are more disciplined, but the soldiers of the second army are better at riding horses. Just one single soldier of the better horse riding army could easily defeat 2 of the more disciplined soldiers. But 10 of the more disciplined soldiers could easily defeat 10 of the better horse riders, and 1,000 of the more disciplined soldiers could easily defeat 2,000 of the better horse riders. Different quantities will lead to differing qualities. An army with the quality of consisting of quantities of more disciplined soldiers will defeat an equally sized army with the quality of consisting of better horse riders. You get it? Just in case you don't, because there's a good chance you don't, here's one more example. Let's say you love pecans, but you hate walnuts. If I gave you 2 bowls of nuts, you would be likely to eat the entire bowl of pecans, but you'd be unlikely to touch the bowl of walnuts. Now, both bowls have the quality of being bowls of nuts, but they have different quantities, and those lead to very different material outcomes. Now, back to intersectionalism, Kimberle Crenshaw wrote that ignoring differences within groups frequently contributes to tension among groups. And this statement is a wonderful foundation for Dialectical Material Analysis of Intersectionality. Crenshaw notes that one large group, or quality, as we say in the dialectics, consists of many smaller groups, or quantities. So from a leftist Marxist perspective, the larger overarching quality is the working class. The working class can be said to be composed of individual workers, but that grossly oversimplifies things. And every major Marxist theorist in history has realized that the working class can really be broken down into smaller groups, which must be united together through class consciousness to assume the quality of a united working class with revolutionary potential. Now, Vladimir Lenin was deeply concerned with the fragmentation of the working class into disparate groups. The fragmented groups that Lenin was most concerned with were all of the various occupations and trades that existed in the late 19th century in Russia, where he was from. So Lenin saw the Russian working class as broadly dissected into an agricultural peasantry and urban intellectual workers. Industrial workers were further divided into various trades, and each of these trades was represented by an individual trade union. So Lenin realized that the key to a successful revolution in Russia was uniting the various trade unions into a cohesive whole, and then uniting the peasants from various regions into a cohesive whole, and then uniting the peasants and the industrial workers into one united working class. And this was honestly a form of intersectionalist analysis. And this analysis and the praxis of building all these disparate groups into a united working class had to happen before the working class could assume a successful revolutionary quality. Now, note that Lenin did not lead the Russians to victory by ignoring the divisions of the working class. He scientifically analyzed the division of the Russian working class, and he diligently and methodically worked with his comrades to dissolve those divisions and rework the working class into a cohesive whole. If he just buried his head in the sand and he pretended that there were no differences and no divisions, if he deceived himself into believing that the peasants and the factory workers were all facing exactly the same hardships and were oppressed in exactly the same way, there would never have been a successful revolution of the working class in Russia. In fact, as Lenin pointed out time and time again, there were deep divisions and animosities and misunderstandings between urban industrial workers and rural peasants, just as the different trade unions were at odds with one another, and unifying all of these disparate quantities into one unified quality was a monumental task, and it took years and years of hard work. And Lenin would have failed outright if he ignored these conflicts and simply took it for granted that the working class would naturally unify and spontaneously rally into a unified revolutionary working class. So next, let's look at the principles of motion. Materialism is rooted in understanding physical processes, and physical processes are never static. Objects in the real world are constantly moving and changing, from the smallest subatomic particles to the largest galaxies. Understanding that all things are constantly moving and changing, even if they appear to be static and unchanging, is fundamental to understanding Marxist dialectical materialism. As Engels puts it, motion is the mode of existence of matter. Never anywhere has there been matter without motion, or motion without matter, nor can there be. And this was an amazingly shrewd observation when you realize that Engels was writing these words decades before Einstein's theory of relativity. But what's most important for leftists to understand about this law of motion as it relates to the material is that it applies to social systems as well as the physical. Society is in a constant state of motion, flux, and change. The working class is in a constant state of flux. The individuals who compose the working class, the quantities that make up the working class. The individuals are quantities of the smaller groups of workers, and then those groups of workers are quantities of the quality of the working class. Make sense? And all of these are in a constant state of motion and flux. And the capitalist class is also dynamic, constantly moving and changing. And the capitalist class is constantly developing ways of better oppressing the working class. So these processes can be manipulated in various ways. So ideological activists like Lenin might be able to catalyze the working class to advance more rapidly towards revolution, just like a catalyst chemical agent can accelerate a chemical change in the physical world. And capitalist elites are also able to manipulate social dynamics in various ways. Capitalist forces can catalyze their own interests and retard the interests of the working class, and this can occur over many years and has occurred throughout the many years of capitalist hegemony. So the capitalist class manipulates the working class in various ways. They work together and they consolidate their power, and they use various means to disrupt and retard the class interest of workers. And it's the job of the revolutionary leftist to study how social forces can be manipulated, how capitalists manipulate society, and how we can fight back against that capitalist manipulation of the working class. The social momentum of the working class is intrinsically tied to material conditions. When work conditions at a unionized factory become very bad, the union is likely to go on strike. If the workers are not unionized, they are much less likely to go on strike and protect their own interests, even if the conditions become very bad. In this sense, a workers' union is a catalyzing agent for class consciousness and worker solidarity and worker action. And unions retard the interests of the capitalist class and catalyze the interests of the working class. In the modern material environment of the United States of America, strikes are much less common than they once were because unions are much less powerful than they used to be. Capitalists have managed to undermine and weaken worker organization, and they've thus been able to manipulate the social dynamics and material conditions of the working class. As workers are mistreated and abused, we slowly but surely become affected, and we are incrementally moved by pain and injury and outrage to a deeper understanding of our own oppression. But without unions and other catalysts that promote the interest of the working class, this process can take a very long time, and the scientific manipulation of social motion by capitalists can slow down these processes and misdirect the energy of the working class. And capitalists have many tools and weapons with which they manipulate the working class. They have the police, they have limited social welfare programs, they have demagogical politicians who offer false hope and deceitful promises, and these are all tools which capitalists can use to manipulate the social forces that would otherwise lead to a united working class. And one of the most powerful weapons capitalists have against the working class is identity-based oppression. Through identity oppression, capitalists are able to manipulate and divide the working class. A great example of this is in the southeastern United States, where I'm from. In the Deep South, race has long been used to divide and conquer the working class. Now, Dubois pointed this out very shrewdly when he pointed out that the vital role of slavery in early American class structure, it didn't just hurt the slaves themselves, it also hurt poor white workers who had to put their labor into competition with these unpaid slaves. And the end of slavery catalyzed white workers to organize in the South in meaningful ways for the first time. As Dubois wrote, in the USA, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin where in the black it is branded. But out of the death of slavery, a new life at once arose. The first fruit of the Civil War was the 8 hours agitation that ran with the 7-leagued boots of the locomotive from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that's true. The railroad workers were very quick to start to organize and resist capitalism. They were highly catalyzed by the end of slavery, and a lot of organization work was done right after the Civil War. But tragically, this revolution was suppressed by American capitalists heavily. The capitalists quickly realized that in order to maintain their class dominance, they needed workers to work cheaply on the land that was once worked by slaves. So this led to a very comprehensive set of strategies that suppressed black and white workers. Dubois showed that the capitalist elites quickly turned white workers against black workers in the post-slavery era. Sharecropping and Jim Crow laws and other institutions preserved slavery, in a sense, in every way that mattered to the capitalists, at least. It kept black workers mired in poverty and social subservience, and it kept them just beneath white workers, poor workers, in the social hierarchy. So poor white workers were given a slightly elevated position in American society, and capitalists paid white workers not in money, but in what Dubois called the psychological wages of whiteness. So as a very personal example, my grandfather was a poor white man in the rural southeast of the United States of America. When he was a child, he was basically essentially a sharecropper himself. And when I was a kid, he showed me the scars on his hands that he got from picking cotton. And he actually hated that so much that when he was 16 years old, he left and he joined the Navy to escape from that horrible sharecropping existence. But white workers like my grandfather never really developed class consciousness in the Southeast. Instead, white workers of the Southeast took their wages of whiteness and developed a false consciousness of white solidarity. White workers were given a social position that was, even if just slightly superior, it was superior to black workers, even as they were being severely exploited by the capitalist class. Segregation was an important psychological tool that tremendously benefited the capitalists most of all. White workers in the Southeast might have been poor and they might have been heavily exploited, but they could eat at the white diners and drink at the white water fountains. They were pacified in countless ways through capitalist manipulation that made them believe in their racial superiority over blacks. Segregation may have ended in the civil rights era, but racial division is still very strong across the United States and especially in the Southeast. Structural racism now keeps the working class divided. And post-segregation structural racism and these wages of whiteness have led to what some call racism without racists. That is to say, individual white people don't generally consider themselves racist, and they don't necessarily think of their racial group as superior to non-white racial groups anymore. But as a group, they do still have structural advantages over non-whites, and this forestalls, suppresses, and retards class solidarity between white and non-white workers. And I just want to make a note really quick here. I know that biologically and scientifically, race doesn't biologically exist. It is a social structure, but racism absolutely exists. And in terms of social sciences, it can't be denied that race has very real material impact on people's lives. And this was especially pronounced to me, again, personally, as I grew up in South Carolina. The lunchrooms in my schools were divided by race. There were black tables and there were white tables, and it was very rare for anyone to cross over in the lunchroom. The honors and AP classes that I sat in were overwhelmingly white, while the more remedial classes were overwhelmingly non-white. The worst example I can remember is when I spent 1 year at a private school in rural South Carolina, and there were only 2 non-white students in that entire school. It was a K through 12 school. There were 2 non-white students in that entire school, K through 12. The public school, which was just down the road, was almost completely populated by non-white students. And my white private school was well funded and it was safe and had good teachers, while the black public school was so underfunded that it was considered a part of what we called the corridor of shame, which was a collection of predominantly black rural schools that were notorious for being some of the worst and most dangerous schools in the United States of America. So I grew up in an environment that was segregated not by the law, but by invisible social and cultural and economic forces. I was paid, even as a child, in the wages of whiteness, and I never questioned this de facto form of segregation. I took it for granted. As a child, it never occurred to me to have much concern for those non-white students who were suffering in the system just down the road from where I was in my nice private school. I was just glad to be where I was, and I was happy to have my superior position. I felt no solidarity with those black peers of mine who were suffering. None of my teachers or my family members ever really brought it up. And I didn't hate black people. I didn't think white people were superior to black people, but I really felt no solidarity with those black students who were suffering, and I never questioned the system. I accepted my wages of whiteness, and I benefited from structural racism without even knowing what was going on. Capitalists have engineered and refined the system of racial segregation of the working class throughout modern history. So what began as brutally apparent chattel slavery has been advanced and refined through the process of negation. Slavery was negated into Jim Crow oppression, which was negated into segregation, which has been negated into a much more subtle, but still materially very substantial form of structural racism. The process of negation has advanced race division from the simple to the complex. So slavery was a simple system with a very starkly evident underpinning. White people literally owned black people. It was easy to see at a quick glance exactly how the system worked, which made it relatively easy to dismantle. All they had to do was make it illegal for white people to own black people, and slavery as it existed evaporated, or rather it was negated. Once slavery was outlawed, capitalists were forced to negate that racial division into increasingly more subtle and more advanced and more complex forms of race oppression. So segregation was more advanced than slavery, and it required much more sophisticated legislative effort and social effort to start to dismantle that through the civil rights movement. It wasn't as easy as saying like, okay, white people can't own black people anymore. We had to make a lot of more subtle changes. And structural racism is an even further negation of racial oppression. It's a highly advanced form of racial oppression and division of the working class. It is particularly insidious, this new form of structural racism, because it is so discrete and concealable and complex. It's actually possible to deny that structural racism even exists, and many people do. And this benefits the capitalist class because in terms of the letter of the law, racism has been abolished. It makes it easy to kind of sweep under the rug, so to speak, and hide and make it look like there's no such thing as structural racism, whenever people who are oppressed through structural racism definitely know that it exists. Non-whites know intrinsically that they are racially oppressed. They feel and observe this oppression every day with their own senses. It is a very material phenomenon to non-white people. But a lot of white people, maybe even most, and even some non-white people can be deceived into believing that structural racism doesn't exist. And this is an incredibly powerful weapon of class oppression. Structural racism is the result of centuries of scientific advancement of race oppression, which benefits capitalism tremendously. To deny that structural racism exists, or to deny that its impact on the working class is fundamental to the way that capitalism operates today, would be just as foolish as it would have been for Lenin to deny that there was division between the industrial and the agricultural elements of the working class in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, of course, race isn't the only way in which the working class is divided scientifically by capitalists. Capitalism has catalyzed and developed many other forms of oppression which help to keep the working class divided and protect their own capitalist interests. So in order to grapple with this complicated network of oppressive systems, let's first address contradictions. Marx noted that all aspects of nature are fundamentally based on contradictions. These contradictions are polar opposites, just like the north and south poles on a magnet, but these polar opposites always inherently form a sort of a unity. So we could not have a northern face of a magnet without a southern face. If we cut the magnet in half, we do not end up with a north magnet and a south magnet. They are inseparable. What we would end up instead with are two magnets, which each have a north face and a south face, respectively. Dialectical materialism demonstrates that contradictions exist in all things and all ideas. Every object exists as and within a system of contradictions. In the physical world, we have contradictions such as light and dark, hot and cold, and so on and so on, and so forth. And so human society is also based on contradictions. And these contradictions are behind all motion, all change, and all negation. The most fundamental contradiction of capitalism, of course, is the opposition between the capitalist class and the working class. But within these contradicting classes, there are deeper, further contradictions. So the capitalist class moves according to its own internal overarching contradiction. Individual capitalists are driven to drive wages as low as possible to maximize their own profits, while the capitalist class as a whole wants wages to be as high as possible so they can charge higher prices for products and services. And these are contradictory forces, which are fundamental quantities which form the quality of the capitalist class. By studying contradictions like these, we can discover deeper understandings of social processes, and we can get a better understanding of how things are negated within society and how we can negate them ourselves. So structural racism is essentially a contradiction. White workers would benefit tremendously by resisting structural racism and uniting with non-white workers, and yet white workers also benefit from structural racism, which makes white workers less likely to oppose and fight to dismantle structural racism. In other words, structural racism is an unstable and dynamic system of contradictions that is scientifically exacerbated by the capitalist class. To complicate things further, structural racism and structural sexism compose a contradiction of their own. Black men and black women would benefit tremendously from uniting together and fighting both structural racism and structural sexism together, but black men, as Crenshaw points out, benefit in certain ways from structural sexism, which puts black men at odds in some ways with black women. It's easy to see how this gets incredibly complicated, and the more forms of oppression we throw into the mix, the more complicated it becomes. Structural ableism and structural sexism and structural racism and structural homophobia and structural transphobia all intersect and interact with one another in this staggeringly complicated tangle of contradictions. And within any individual, these contradictions all exist in the form of one's individual identity. And capitalism has scientifically advanced all of these contradictions into a system of oppression that keeps the working class fundamentally divided in ways that sometimes overlap, sometimes interlock, and always form contradictions. And these contradictions drive social motion, just as the overarching contradictions of class drive social motion. And the only way to build a unified class is to negate these contradictions. Lenin realized this, which is why he put so much thought and effort into negating the contradictions between the various trade unions of industrial workers, as well as negating the contradictions between the agricultural and industrial workers. Only by negating contradictions like these can class unity finally be achieved. Ignoring contradictions within the working class or insisting that they are unimportant will only lead to deeper contradictions and increased division. Which brings us back to that quote from Kimberle Crenshaw. Ignoring differences within groups frequently contributes to tension among groups. The only way to unite the working class is to negate the contradictions that hold the working class back. And the only way to negate those contradictions is to identify them, to recognize them, and to do the work of negating them. And this is the scientific basis of leftist intersectionalism. But in order to truly define leftist intersectionalism, we must first look at some contradicting philosophies. So we'll begin with liberal identity politics. I would argue that liberal identity politics are a primary catalyzing agent which capitalists use to negate working class solidarity. So let's try to define liberal identity politics and how they contradict leftist intersectionalism. Liberal identity politics on the surface seek to reduce the suffering of marginalized people within the framework of capitalism. Because capitalists control the means of production, they also control the surplus profits of industry, which of course means that they control the vast majority of wealth in society. It's by withholding this wealth from the majority of human beings that capitalists are able to put tremendous leverage on society and thus control society and the working class in various ways. So liberals seek to sort of stabilize capitalist society by finding a balance in resource redistribution. In other words, liberal identity politics ask capitalists to withhold less in terms of resources like money and power to distribute them to oppressed people. This is why liberals are so obsessed with taxation. They think that the best way to fight oppression is by taxing capitalists, not by removing the ability of capitalists to exploit workers, but by taxing them. They're still allowed to exploit workers, but we'll tax them. So for example, liberals might demand that capitalists give more money to social programs and college funds and other institutions that reduce the suffering of various oppressed groups through donations and taxes and things like that. Liberal identity politics also try to put people from vulnerable groups into positions of power within the capitalist framework. So rather than dismantling the capitalist framework, they seek to be more representative in how power is distributed to various people from various oppressed groups. In essence, liberals use identity politics to try to stabilize the power dynamics of capitalism by forcing capitalists to withhold fewer resources from vulnerable groups. And I have to say very clearly that this does indeed reduce suffering for various vulnerable groups within capitalism. And in that sense, I support liberal measures and actions and policies that reduce the suffering of working people, because I don't want working people to suffer because of their identity. But ultimately, there is a fundamental contradiction in liberal identity politic praxis. Because as long as capitalists control the means of production and they control the wealth, and as long as they control the wealth, they have tremendous power to manipulate our society, and fundamental change will never occur. Liberal identity politics are ultimately doomed to failure because they treat all of these disparate segments of society as smaller individual groups, and they ultimately do not recognize that all of these splintered quantities, all these groups, these quantities, are contained within the larger quality of the working class. And liberal forms cannot negate the contradictions between identity oppression and class oppression because they refuse to recognize that they are a contradiction. So that sounded really complicated. Let me put it another way. Liberal identity politics attempt the impossible. They seek to stabilize capitalism and make capitalism a just system by manipulating how much capitalists withhold from various oppressed identity groups without acknowledging that higher level contradiction of class conflict. Capitalism is inherently exploitative. And so the idea that you can use the capitalist system and somehow reform the capitalist system to make it a just system is impossible because there's that inherent contradiction between the capitalist class and the working class. Liberal identity politics can and do diminish suffering for certain individual identity groups. So if you pass something like a college fund or a social program or a law that benefits an oppressed identity group, that's a good thing, and it does help some people. But this is really kind of key to understanding all of this. The capitalist class is still able to control what's withheld and what's not. They hold the reins to all of society. And it is through restricting and withholding resources that they're able to manipulate all these various groups. In fact, we have enough resources in a developed capitalist nation like the United States of America for everyone to be able to get health care and go to college and have material conditions met. But by withholding those resources and restricting those resources, capitalists are able to turn society into kind of a zero-sum game. And they're able to manipulate the working class to where we're all basically fighting each other for resources, for attention, for desperately needed aid. It's a very insidious and kind of evil genius method for controlling society. Because now, within the capitalist system, you have all of these different groups, and they're splintered up, and they're intersecting in all these complicated ways, and it's very difficult for the people who are being oppressed to achieve any kind of permanent status. It's very difficult. It takes a very long time, and it's fraught with advances and retreats and successes and failures. And this group, one day, LGBTQ people might get a victory today and a setback tomorrow. And you might have different groups kind of vying against each other for attention. It's a really, it's a sick way of manipulating our society to keep the working class divided. There's only one way to permanently negate all of the various forms of class conflict, and that is to really try to understand how racism and sexism and ableism and all of these other quantities and contradictions that are identity oppression compose the larger quality of the working class. In other words, we have to try to understand exactly how capitalists control and manipulate society to keep us divided. So liberals and liberal identity politics versus leftist class reductionism, they are a contradiction because they both fail to see the whole. Each one of them sees one contradiction of a whole, of a unified pair of contradictions. Liberals refuse to recognize that all of these different identity group quantities, all of these different forms of identity oppression, make up together the quality of the working class. So liberals refuse to see that all these forms of identity oppression fall under the umbrella of working class oppression. And class reductionists, on the other hand, refuse to address the fact that the working class has been negated by capitalists into this vast entanglement of oppressed identity groups. So one of the things about dialectical material analysis is that things are often two things at the same time, and there can be contradictions within contradictions. And this is an example where you have all of these different forms of identity oppression, racism, sexism, etc. You have working class oppression, and they're the same thing. So class reductionists present the thesis that the working class is a united entity, and that all other forms of identity oppression are unimportant. We only have to focus specifically on working class oppression. So class reductionists say that in order to overthrow capitalism and liberate all people, we must focus exclusively on class consciousness and stop paying attention to identity politics. So to the class reductionist, identity oppression is sort of an irrelevant distraction from class consciousness. And the only path to liberation of the working class is to ignore identity oppression and focus exclusively on toppling capitalism. And once capitalism has been dismantled, it will be easy to address all these other forms of oppression, in our post-capitalist society. Liberals have an antithesis to that. They say that class oppression is just one of many forms of oppression, and that we must try to identify every single individual form of oppression and tackle them individually. And that there is no united working class. There is no hope for a united working class. There are only these various disparate forms of oppression, which must be addressed separately and within the framework of capitalism. Class consciousness and class revolution is a reductionist and unachievable fantasy because the real problems of oppression are primarily tied to identity oppression. And we should ignore class struggle and focus on ending these individual systemic flaws and eliminating them from the capitalist system, and then all of the oppressed people can be liberated. So in other words, liberals see class struggle as an unwanted distraction, and class reductions see identity struggle as an unwanted distraction. They don't see that these are contradictions within contradictions. Leftist intersectionalists, on the other hand, see the synthesis of this conflict between identity oppression and class oppression. And we see that the contradictory relationship between class oppression and identity oppression is fundamental to how capitalists control our society and retard the progress of the working class. So just to summarize, liberals present the thesis that only identity politics matter and that there is no sense in wasting time thinking about class consciousness and class revolution. Class reductionists see identity politics as a complete waste of time and a distraction, and want to only focus, their antithesis is that we should only focus on class consciousness and class revolution and ignore all other forms of identity oppression. Leftist intersectionalists see all of these different forms of identity oppression as weapons and as intentionally negated systems of oppression that are used to divide the working class and keep us from working together. So now we have all the pieces in place to properly and fully define leftist intersectionalism and to prove that intersectionalism is fundamental to negating all the divided identity quantities into a united working class, which will in turn be able to negate capitalism. So intersectionalism is what will allow us to take all these different quantities that have been intentionally and unconsciously negated by capitalists to divide the working class. Intersectionalism will allow us to negate those negations and negate those contradictions of identity oppression to build a unified working class and pave the way for a revolution. So now let's define leftist intersectionalism. I think the key problem with class reductionists is that they conflate liberal identity politics with leftist intersectionalism, and that is a flagrant misunderstanding of leftist intersectionalism. We know that modern capitalism has scientifically divided the working class into a complex ecosystem of oppressed identity groups, and this constitutes a fundamental contradiction. The working class is monolithic in the sense that the entire working class is oppressed, but the working class is simultaneously fractured in the sense that we are divided scientifically by capitalism into various disparate and overlapping identity groups, each of which is actively being oppressed in dynamic and constantly shifting ways. So only a fully united working class movement can negate capitalism. Not united by oppression. Of course, all workers are oppressed, but that doesn't unite us in a way that will allow us to negate capitalism. We have to be united in class consciousness. We have to unite into one solid movement. And so just as Lenin knew that the workers of his era had to be unified through the negation of industrial and agricultural worker contradictions and the various trade contradictions into a united working class that was required to negate capitalism in Lenin's time, we intersectionalists know that it is necessary today for all of these various forms of identity oppression to be negated within the working class in order to unite the working class into a solid movement that can functionally negate the capitalist class. As long as we are divided, we stand no hope of negating the capitalist class. Thus, we must develop a scientific system for reuniting all of these disparate groups and reconciling all of these contradictions of identity oppression into a united working class. Class reductionists skip this key step of negating all of these disparate identity contradictions. They believe that the working class can achieve workable revolution without first negating these highly developed contradictions within the working class. And that's silly. And to say that we can have a class revolution without first negating these identity divisions and these identity contradictions is just as facetious as if I walked out in the street right now and I tried to start a revolution by myself as an individual. And I just assume that all of the working class is going to spontaneously rally around me. The material conditions for the revolution are not met until the working class assumes a revolutionary quality. And that quality is unification under class consciousness and the negation of all of these different divisions, which are the contradictions within contradictions. So this revolutionary quality can only be assumed by synthesizing the quantities that compose the splintered working class, race groups, gender groups, the abled and the disabled, and so on and so forth. Class reductionism ignores the quantities and assumes a revolutionary quality of solidarity where none currently exists. Let's look at it this way. A fox assumes that all four-legged creatures are edible, and the fox has a false unconsciousness of the quality of four-legged creatures. So the fox thinks, okay, anything that has four legs, I can eat it. That is until the fox meets a much larger predatory quadruped. This fox must recognize that there are now different quantities at play of which the fox was unaware, and that these quantities fundamentally redefine the quality of quadrupeds. It has to recognize this or it will quickly be eaten itself. Here's another metaphor. So if I go to a gas station, I can correctly assume that the gasoline in the station pump will fuel my car. However, there is what Marx would call a social superstructure in place. The gasoline in the gas pump does not belong to me. it does not have the quality of belonging to me. So it might have the quality of powering my car, but it does not have the quality of belonging to me. So if I pump that gas into my car and I leave without paying money to the gas station or taking any other actions to address this quality of ownership, I will suffer real consequences. I will probably be arrested and my car will then go nowhere. So class reductionists and intersectionalists both realize that all workers collectively compose the working class. And they realize that we need all workers to be united to drive the revolution forward, just as a car with an empty fuel tank needs that gasoline from that station pump before it can be driven forward. However, class reductionists fail to recognize, or they choose to ignore, the ways in which capitalists have scientifically catalyzed sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression. Capitalism has intentionally weaponized and built up these contradictions within the working class to divide us. And they believe that these scientifically catalyzed qualities of identity oppression can be instantly negated if we simply speak and act as if racism and sexism are insignificant in comparison to classism. Class reductionists fail to give non-class forms of oppression their due consideration. They assume that focusing solely on class, we can unite the working class, and that non-class oppression will just quickly evaporate after that. Now, even many leftist intersectionalists also make false assumptions about identity oppression. So some intersectionalist leftists see non-class oppression as like subsegments of class oppression. So they see the working class as a static sub-hierarchy, where white able-bodied cishet men are at the top, and then like black straight men are beneath them somewhere, and then trans disabled lesbian women are beneath them in this kind of static system. So there's like some intersectionalists think there's this static hierarchy of oppression. But material dialectics show that there are no static systems. All systems in society and in nature are in constant motion and flux. And so even though some forms of oppression might seem very static, like for instance, Black people have been oppressed for a very, very long time, there are always these little fluctuations and changes and these dynamics at play. And so identity oppression systems are also in a constant state of flux. And again, capitalists manipulate these dynamics all the time. So for example, in the USA, the status of LGBTQ plus people is in a constant state of flux. When I was growing up, it felt like, gay people were constantly kind of improving their situation in society. And then, 1 year, gay marriage is passed. It really feels like things are just moving forward and the train's never going to stop. LGBTQ people are just going to have it better and better and better. But then not long later, suddenly trans people are barred from entering public restrooms. Suddenly, homophobia seems to be on the rise in our culture. So this flux occurs within and among different identity groups with this constant rising and falling and progressing and setbacks and advancing and retreating. So this fluctuation is constantly, again, being manipulated by capitalists, by fascists, and by other reactionaries. And they've been able to scientifically develop these dynamics. They've been able to further negate the solidarity of the working class and further catalyze these interlocking systems of identity oppression so that they can create this incredibly powerful system of interlocking, overlapping, intersecting forms of oppression. So one polar opposite of the reactionary scientific development of class oppression systems are the individual experiences of the oppressed. Every individual has a very unique set of intersecting identities, and these identities set in conflict with other identities and maybe even with identities within the individual. And this breaks down the possibility of monolithic class consciousness until all of these contradictions are negated. So Dubois described what he called the double consciousness of the Black American. He pointed out that Black Americans suffered from internal contradictions within their own psyches, within their own identities. As Dubois puts it, a Black American is always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist white society and measuring oneself by the means of a nation that looked back in contempt. This double consciousness also exists within the working class and is exacerbated by class reductionism. So think about it. As long as class reductionists fail or refuse to recognize and address and work to negate identity oppression within society and within our movement, oppressed people have to contend with this double consciousness, and that will prevent a singular class consciousness from ever emerging. In other words, when class reductionists say that, racial oppression and LGBTQ issues and gender discrimination, when they downplay the importance and the roles that these forms of oppression play, they are exacerbating, they are making things worse in terms of dividing the working class. Because, a person who's oppressed in various ways, like a black, lesbian, trans, disabled person, is having a material experience of oppression. They know that they are being oppressed in all these different ways. And if we try to downplay the complexity and the very serious nature of all those different forms of oppression, and we say, oh, those are like not as important, we just need to focus on class, how are we going to get those people to trust us? How are we going to get people who are suffering from so many different kinds of oppression to trust us? It's an impossible ask. And I personally can't take somebody seriously if they tell me that, the fact that, trans people are getting murdered, highly disproportionate to non-trans people, but that's not so important. We just need to focus only on class oppression. Like, I can't take that seriously. These are very material conditions that we're talking about. So the only way to unify the working class is by negating these contradictions of identity oppression within the working class. And if we ignore those contradictions within our movement, then we have no hope for uniting so that we can then negate capitalism. And this is work that can be done simultaneously, by the way. We can be building class consciousness as we simultaneously work to negate and dismantle other forms of identity oppression, especially within our own movement. That should be a high priority, is negating forms of identity oppression within our own movement. So leftist intersectionalism is the science of undoing all of the scientific work which reactionaries in the capitalist class have done to fragment the working class and set us against each other. It is the science of unifying the working class. So in summary, leftist intersectionalism seeks to catalyze the reintegration of a united working class. We have to scientifically analyze and understand the ways in which capitalists catalyze the division of the working class. We have to slow down and stop those processes. We have to simultaneously develop catalytic processes of our own to negate those divisions and reassemble the splintered working class into a united working class. And the only way to do this is to recognize and do things about those contradictions within the working class, those contradictions which are caused by identity oppression. We must listen carefully to people who suffer from oppression and try to articulate and understand the nature of identity oppression so that we can negate it and dismantle it and negate those contradictions that are keeping our working class movement divided. So Dubois himself scientifically analyzed the nature of oppression in Philadelphia, and he proved that the problems of Black Americans were the result of structural racism and not symptoms of racial inferiority. And that was very fundamental in advancing the cause, not just of the Black people who are oppressed, but the working class. Because again, in order to unite the working class, we have got to expose and defeat the lie that Black people are like inherently inferior to white people. We need scientific work like that, not just to end the oppression of Black people, but also to unite the working class. Because if there are white workers who believe that they have racial superiority over Black workers, you're not going to get class unity. And you're never going to be able to negate capitalism, because you need a united working class to negate capitalism. Because capitalism has scientifically developed identity oppression, we as leftists must scientifically develop strategies and tactics and platforms that will dissolve all of these differences and unsplinter us and negate those contradictions. There is no way that we can overcome this very advanced, complicated work that the capitalism has done to divide the working class. They've put tremendous resources into exacerbating and worsening these divisions within the working class. There's no way we can do this by ignoring these forms of identity oppression. Oppressed people know, again, that they are oppressed in various ways, and they want concrete solutions. And they want evidence that all of these forms of oppression will be addressed and dissolved by any movement that they might be considering joining. Lenin could not have ignored the splintering of the working class in Russia, between industrial and agricultural workers, and we cannot ignore the very real identity oppression that exists not just within society, but also within our movement. And not only that, but it is material evidence, speaking of our movement, that class revolution does not inherently lead to the dissolution of other forms of oppression. The USSR had problems with racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia. Vietnam has issues with sexism today. Every communist revolution that's occurred, it didn't just like instantly lead to all of these other forms of oppression disappearing and evaporating. And people who are oppressed based on their identity know this, and they have every right to be skeptical of a workers' movement that doesn't acknowledge the different forms of identity oppression that they're facing, and that doesn't seek aggressively to negate those forms of identity oppression. Every step that we as leftists make towards dismantling, for instance, racial oppression, unifies the working class, weakens capitalism, and pushes our movement forward. These things reinforce each other, both in terms of the way that they oppress the working class, but they also, by fighting them together simultaneously, those actions reinforce each other and make us a stronger movement. So it makes sense to combat all these different forms of identity oppression within our movement as we work to dismantle the overarching power differential of capitalist domination. And it's through intersectionalist analysis and praxis that we will simultaneously strengthen our movement, weaken capitalism, reduce the possibility that non-class forms of oppression will survive into a post-capitalist society. And we should want very much to make sure that any post-capitalist society we build does not have these forms of identity oppression. And there's no reason we can't start working on that right now. Working to dissolve these divisions and these forms of oppression, identity oppression, are good for us in so many ways. As Crenshaw wrote, recognizing that identity politics takes place at the site where categories intersect thus seems more fruitful than challenging the possibility of talking about categories at all. Through an awareness of intersectionality, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us and negotiate the means by which these differences will find expression in constructing group politics. And I believe that Crenshaw's words here can easily be translated into the language of dialectical materialism. Intersections of oppression are, in and of themselves, contradictions. And before we can negate that higher level of class contradiction by negating the capitalist class, we must negate all the lower level contradictions of identity oppression, or at least make significant progress in doing so. And the only way to dismantle and negate those forms of identity oppression is to diligently suss out those contradictions and find ways to negate them. And none of this means that we have to, wait. A lot of class reductionists say like, oh, we can't wait to dismantle race oppression or gender oppression or whatever. We can't wait. We have to do the class revolution thing as soon as possible because it's getting worse. And we don't have to wait. We can be doing all of these things simultaneously. So the process of constructing a united working class is really the process of negating the scientifically catalyzed, identity-based contradictions which keep us divided. So intersectionalist analysis and praxis are instrumental to building unified class consciousness among workers. In conclusion, leftist intersectionalism is merely the recognition that the working class has been fractured into an amalgam of contradictions rooted in identity oppression, and it is a commitment to negating those contradictions so that we can build a united working class, which is, again, the prerequisite for negating capitalism. To focus exclusively on class consciousness without recognizing the contradictions that exist within the working class is a failure in dialectical material analysis. So how can intersectionalism be put into praxis? How can we begin that very important work of negating these contradictions of identity oppression which fracture the working class? Well, that'll be the subject of a future video. So if you want to find out, negate the contradiction that you are not subscribed by clicking subscribe. Until then, I'm American Johnson. This is NonCompete. Thanks for watching.
An issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation.
social problems, despite the names they bear, change and change radically in the course of time. Indeed, social problems change more often and in more ways than physical problems because of the unpredictable variations in human feelings and choices. They are subject to the same physical laws as sticks and stones, but there is enough of what we call will and volition to make it necessary for persons who are studying a human problem or trying to conduct their action in accordance with its present manifestations to keep a wary eye on changes and on current facts. From 1876 until our day, the race problem in the United States of the Negro has been primarily a struggle to regain the right to vote in the midst of caste discrimination, changing slowly but definitely to a problem of the right to work and to be trained for work at all levels, and to a struggle for broad civil and social rights. Most of you, I think, assume that this is still the Negro problem. But you must be warned that it is not wholly or mainly that now. That the reason that it is not is because of the fundamental changes now spreading over the whole world. Whereas in the 18th century the world thought that progress and emancipation were coming from popular education and universal suffrage, we know now that more fundamental than these important rights is the economic organization of the world. That is, the way in which the labor of human beings is organized to satisfy human needs. This question is so fundamental that all other questions of political power, of education, and human happiness depend upon it. This is the basic reason for the rise of philanthropy, of socialism, and the attempt at complete realization of socialism through communism.